Why don't we start? 3 minutes pass. I think more people are attending. Thank you everybody for coming in today. Malika, can you start the recording, please?
Yeah, done, Ali.
Oh, thank you very much, Malika. All right. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We have a great event ahead of us. We're going to talk about PCI 4.0. My name is Ali Afshari, and I run security at Benchmark. We have two great attendees today. Shlomo Bilak, who's our CTO at Benchmark, and David Meltzer, who is the CTO at Tripwire. I want to thank you both for joining us today. So before we start, I want to thank everyone, taking the day, joining us during COVID time. I know everybody's kind of stuck at home, and I was just checking the latest stats. The good news is I think we're 25% of the population have their first dose. So that's great news, and I'm hoping that everyone's going to be healthy during the lockdown we have in Canada. So today we got together. We're going to talk about PCI 4.0, which is an update to, based on my research, the 9th update to the PCI overall compliance, and it will be released end of the summer. So we have some time ahead of us to kind of get ahead of the curve, understand what PCI 4.0 will bring, what changes it will bring from the current requirements. And also, after the release of the 4.0, we still have a couple of years to be compliant for that, for the 4.0 event. So I think we have some time ahead of us. We wanted to have this conversation with the number of good leaders in the industry to get the information out there, to share it with you guys. So that's great. I want to just inform everyone that the event's being recorded. And I want to thank Tripwire for also sending out some great Uber Eats gift to anyone that's attending the event. So thank you, Tripwire, for that. So let's start. Let's first meet, David. Why don't you introduce yourself to the attendees? Maybe do a little bit of a conversation about who Tripwire is for those who don't know. And then thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, Ali, and thank you to Benchmark for sponsoring this event with us today. First, a quick introduction to myself. My name is Dave Meltzer, CTO at Tripwire. I have been in the commercial security product space for the last 25 years now. I started at Internet Security Systems. For those of you who've been in security for a long time, I developed intrusion detection systems, vulnerability management systems, been the CTO of a couple of security companies, Cambia Security, Encircle, and now Tripwire. Now let me tell you a little bit about Tripwire. Tripwire has been around for 20 years now, started at Purdue University, and has been a leader in the spaces around security and compliance, particularly around security controls for file integrity monitoring, security configuration management, and vulnerability management. Tripwire started with a really simple concept, which is if you don't know the state of your systems and how they're changing, how could you possibly keep them secure? And this was a time back where people had a handful of servers, and now the problem is almost flipped on its head from people not having any visibility to we have avalanches of data about what's going on. But today, how do you make sense of it? Well, it turns out because of Tripwire's history, we were baked into just about every security regulation and compliance framework out there, and we'll talk more about our history with PCI as well. And from those that upstart, we have thousands of customers around the world today. Today, we offer software products to help people comply with compliance regulations like PCI, as well as helping provide basic security hygiene and foundational security controls. We help do that in everything from traditional IT systems, your Windows and Linux desktops and servers, backend infrastructure like network devices, and today extending all the way into the cloud, as well as into industrial control systems as well. Our solutions are available either as software that you can deploy either on-premise or within your own cloud environments, or as managed services where we take care of all that backend and deploy and host it in the cloud for you. And we do have local managed services and data residency in Canada, so that you can keep all of your data resident within the country.
Thank you, David. That was great. Virtually to your right, it's Shlomo Bilak, who's the CTO of Benchmark. Shlomo, why don't you take a few minutes to introduce yourself to our attendees? Maybe they don't know you, maybe they've never seen you speak. Talk about Benchmark, and let's talk about a little bit of what you do at Benchmark.
Sure. I basically run our DevOps, DevSecOps practice. I've previously been a CISO at a Fortune 500 heading application security. So I've taken organizations, federal, municipal, enterprise, my own organization through PCI compliance. I've done PCI audits myself. I've worked with QSAs like Coal Fire in the United States or a Control Case in Canada. I've wrote courseware on DevSecOps for the DevOps Institute. So my background's more around creating CI/CD processes that administer and facilitate security. I was familiar with SSF about a year ago when PCI DSS was trying to update. I worked with some of the people who were writing it to come up with what should be within the software processes. I think they're just catching up with, there were gaps. So we'll cover some of that today and how we can approach that to solve those challenges that are going to be very difficult for most organizations.
Yeah. Shlomo, this is great. I mean, I know that you focus on DevOps and DevSecOps. Maybe for attendees, maybe you can just expand on what is DevSecOps and I think that we come from a security background and we've been behind the DevOps process. And DevSecOps, it seems to be the topic of discussion at every organization today.
I think it just fundamentally came out of the comments, security slows me down. And we haven't seen that reverse. So the statistics are still against security professionals. And we kind of developed our own white paper on governance engineering, where we incorporate the bailiwick of security and not try to shift left all their dependencies, responsibilities, and accountability to devs. It doesn't work. As you'll see within this event regarding PCI and all the updates, it's way more than just code. Like, I don't think there's a single security framework that can be administered using secure code. There's a lot more around it. So you need to take the bailiwick of security, collaborate with them, create responsive pipelines to security requirements. So don't just gate. I kind of find most of the organizations that think security slows them down because they operate within a gating model. Gating doesn't work. The reason being is if you're at 10% compliance because you measure it today and everybody took the risk of measuring it, if you go to 12, treat them well, get an Uber Eats card, right? You did a good job. If you go to 8, slow them down and find out why you're not adopting now that we're measuring. So I think that's where DevSecOps plays, creating collaboration between the security team within the delivery and deployment model, and then making sure slow down is not the mindset. It's more of respond to your state that you're measuring.
Shlomo, that's great. Thank you. David, going back to you, I know that, Tripwire, you guys have also adopted a DevSecOps or DevOps approach to a lot of the work that you're doing. Maybe you want to expand a little bit on your mindset as a CTO at Tripwire on how you're promoting DevOps and where the conversations you're having with, C-levels around DevOps and security.
Yeah, absolutely. Often people think about DevSecOps and the first thing to think about is application security and that secure coding, as Shlomo talked about. And that's, obviously a very critical component of it. What I would encourage you also to think about is the infrastructure, and as Shlomo kind of alluded to, what is the monitoring implications of having a DevSecOps mindset and having adopted DevOps philosophies and technologies in your infrastructure. So let me give you kind of a quick customer example of someone that I've worked with. I won't mention any company names, but a large wireless carrier and had production servers, and over a long period of time had been changing, doing different tool sets to determine how are we going to push out change to this production environment. Well, when they adopted a DevOps and a DevSecOps mentality and methodology, they started building this CI/CD pipeline for pushing change to their production servers. When you think about what Tripwire does around integrity monitoring and management, in the old way of doing things in their traditional IT systems, they would push change to production and then you had a separate tool that was monitoring the production to tell you what changed. Often Tripwire is that monitoring tool, and there's other things out there in the industry as well. Well, as they adopted DevOps, what they did was they said, well, all configuration changes are going into GitHub now. So it's not a configuration management tool. It's actually looking more like code. And we hear this kind of trend of infrastructure as code is something that's becoming more predominant. They're using tools now like Puppet and Chef for pushing things from code into the production server environment. And so their DevOps pipeline is now getting much more automated about how things go from an administrator first checking something in all the way through to what's the tool pushing it out in production. Well, the real benefit of this now has become, because it's all automated, what you can do at the monitoring level is if you can hook into the pipeline, you can tell when you see something change in the production system, you can go all the way back through that tool chain and say, well, was it the proper DevOps tool that made this change on the system? What was the administrator who checked in that change? And you have full auditability and traceability about approved changes that are flowing through that pipeline. You kind of contrast that to a process just got into the system and started mucking up files, or an administrator SSH'd into the box and started hand editing things. And the most interesting thing of this particular customer that I found was what they said was, when people knew that we were actually monitoring on an ongoing real-time basis whether people were following our DevOps process, people circumventing the process stopped very quickly because they knew that control was in place.
Thank you, David. I think, so let's jump into the PCI 4.0. And I think we've kind of encompassed a lot of the high-level changes that are coming down the pipe. I know that the formal product has not been released. It will not be released until end of summer. We've had a bit of a preview on the PCI requirements. So let's just kind of share some of that stuff. Number one thing that I saw across the board was definitions of roles and responsibilities. An auditor will come in now and you have to be able to showcase who is responsible for that process. So I think that comes back to some of the items that we just talked about is, before it was maybe a document, but now we have to have the roles and responsibilities in there. Maybe going back to either David, to you, that's kind of exactly what you were talking about, right? In the process of CI/CD, in the automation process, we have to now have someone that's responsible for that specific process. Is that something that you guys see as well? Like, within the Tripwire world, are you guys seeing that, that people are becoming tagged as responsible for some of that work?
Yeah, and I'll give you kind of several parts of that spectrum I've seen. I've walked into some organizations and talked to them about how are they doing PCI compliance today, and sometimes they'll give you a stack, like 300 pages of documentation of this is what our process looks like. And my first question is always, well, how can anyone possibly follow this process if it's hundreds and hundreds of pages of documentation? And the fact is, it's more just things for the auditors to look at. And it's not really tightly ingrained into what people are doing on a daily basis. I then contrast that with organizations that I think have more mature processes, and they've built some really more like handbooks, quick run books for individuals within the organization to say, here's the 6 steps you have to follow. And if you do these things, then we're going to adhere to our process. So certainly look at the documentation in your run books and playbooks and say, is this something that's actually usable for the organization? But then, as you mentioned, Ali, the really important part, but also the opportunity now is to automate that. So if you have tools that can define roles and responsibilities, that has role-based access controls built into it, that you can define what is the workflow that you want to follow and start to automate those workflows. And that could be in a variety of different tools and different areas of PCI you're trying to comply with. So certainly within the Tripwire area of things like integrity monitoring, we can do that to make sure that you document, but then you instantiate in an automated way what is the workflow you want your organization to follow. And then it just flows from there that it's all happening. Very different from just having hundreds of pages of documentation that you're just kind of hoping people understand. And especially when you think about this in terms of a sustainable process, which is not just the one person I'm going to train to do this right now, But as people shift and as people get promoted and you bring in new talent to the organization, how do we make sure we can actually continue this process and improve it over time? That's where automation and getting this usable documentation becomes really important.
Thank you, David. I think you talked about a bunch of items in around automation that Shlomo is very passionate about. So maybe, Shlomo, let's go back to you around automation. I think I've heard you in the past use the word, when clients say, hey, I don't need that because I have really smart people, until the smart people leave the room, and you're stuck with not knowing what's going on. Maybe let's talk about a little bit of automation. When you are trying to address these compliance, how does automation in the DevOps world help out?
Sure. I mean, PCI is the pipeline. So all of the security requirements, the cadence checks, the documentation is a requirement, period. If you don't give an auditor your audit prep docs, the thing is, get the pipeline to update the markdown or update your wikis directly so it becomes sustainable. So those 1,000 pages become a valuable updated 1,000 pages, because that's what it takes. You're not working on it. The question becomes who's working on it. So audit prep built into a pipeline, super important. So there is a case study if you want to look it up, NCR Aquasec. We did a pipeline. We were one of the first pipelines ever audit by, let's say, one of the QSAs. So when they came in, they're like, what is this? What is containers? What are you doing with these pipelines? We booked a week on site to review. We did it in 3 hours, the entirety, and then I left. I had to change my flight. I came home. So in 3 hours, we took what the pipeline built and gave it to them. But I'll make a couple comments. I'm not a believer in drift. I'm a believer that if you build it right, you don't need drift. So Chef and Puppet go away. Terraform and things like that replace it. The reason you have drift control or making sure config is right is because people have access. And why do they have access? The only time you're going to have people have access in environments that have good sanitized infrastructure as code, like TFSec, TerraTest, TerraGoat, where you're making sure policy is adopted, or maybe you even have Sentinel where you have policy as code, you're going to build it right from the start. And then you still need sanity check because shit happens. So you have break glass access. That's where the continuous verification is never going to go away. Bad things happen even if you think you're doing things right. So you need organizations like Tripwire to keep your sanity in place when you get overly confident and you start making statements like I'm making, where you think everything's gold, but in reality, you're always going to be moving the bar forward because security continues to advance. So assume you have vulnerabilities, continuously verify, go from a mindset of control the drift to no one has access, build it right first. And then the pipelines themselves do the audit for you. So you turn a 1 week engagement, which is a pain in the ass, into a 3 hour event where they collect your artifacts the pipeline created.
Thank you, Shlomo. So absolutely. So you're taking PCI and you're going to automate the whole process. You're going to make sure that all of the components for you to be audited, including documentation, is automated inside of a tool, and that's what you're saying is a game changer. It's you can make that into its own process. PCI doesn't just become a compliance on an infrastructure; it becomes its own little process.
I mean, you have components that are outside it, but you also have the human involved. So the security professional, instead of blocking people and slowing people down, which was my own team at the time, they are involved. They review. They get all the data comes to them. They go, okay, good. If not good, let me go and figure out what's going on. How did this happen? They're integrated within the process rather than saying, I need a meeting. The moment PCI is controlled by I need a meeting, I couldn't take it. I couldn't stomach it. I couldn't tell the guys, how do you scale if your answer is I need a meeting? So the pipeline was facilitating their involvement so that their bailiwick, which is critical, says this is actually acceptable or not acceptable, or I need to talk to them to improve next time, but you're still going to go because I see you adopting, you've improved from a metrics perspective. That's where you're going. Don't think that the PCI pipeline fixes everything. You still have humans in there for now, but it brings them in. There's collaboration instead of threats, gating and meetings, because it sucks. No one wants to have another meeting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Outside of webinars.
No, that's great. So going back, Dave, I mean, you talked about, I think you kind of talked about FIM a little bit, but I think you and I have spoken in the past, and you mentioned that one of the badges of honor that Tripwire has had was that you were named by name in the first version of PCI when it was released, and said a technology like Tripwire. So can you maybe let's talk about that history a little bit, and what does FIM do, and how FIM helps out across the board around the PCI audit?
Yeah, we grew thousands of organizations around the world using Tripwire because it became a critical part of the PCI DSS and other compliance standards around the world. The basic concept of file integrity monitoring is you need to know if the critical components of your system and your application and your business process are changing. If you don't know if those things are changing, and you don't know the impact to your security and risk posture of those changes, then you're flying blind from a security perspective. And so at a very basic level, it's, there's lots of files, binary files, configuration files that make up your applications. And you just need to be monitoring those for changes. Now, often people kind of stop at that first step and say, well, now I have something that's monitoring, I'm logging that information. And that's not really the spirit of why you're trying to do that. And so really the concept of doing integrity monitoring is that you're not just going to log that data, but you're going to create a process in your organization of how are you going to differentiate between whether something is approved or unapproved to happen within your organization? How are you going to differentiate between whether this is a change that's actually creating more risk for your system, or it's something that's just part of your business as usual? If you look at any typical Windows system, Unix system, network device, it's probably changes happening kind of under the hood all the time. And so what you can't have work is try and get a human involved in looking at every single change. And that's why automation and tooling is so critical, because you need to be able to have something that can differentiate good and bad change for your organization for you. And then there may come a point where you see a particular change and say, well, wow, this is really an indicator of compromise. This is a change to a system file that should not have happened for our organization. Maybe you need to send that to the Security Operations Center or to your SIM tool, because this is actually indicators that maybe an incident's happening. You also may see that you're just violating the policies in documentation. So maybe you say, well, this didn't create a security risk, but you didn't follow my established process. And that, again, that could be, it followed my DevOps tool chain in a more DevOpsy environment. For a more traditional IT environment, it might be, well, my process is I create a change ticket, I have an approval that goes to that change ticket, and then after it's approved, then I can go make the change to production. That's kind of a standard large enterprise change control process. Well, if you can automate that reconciliation and say, well, these changes are happening and did not follow that process at all, now you're getting kind of those process violations. And when auditors are coming in and they're looking for, have you really established a change management process? Have you done integrity monitoring of systems? Which, by the way, is not just files. It's often configuration, it's registry, it's network device settings. It could be cloud services as well. When you start looking at all those things, the evidence is, do I have the control in place to do the monitoring? But then also, am I following the process that I documented for how these changes should be happening?
David, thank you. That's great. One thing that we've seen in the PCI 4.0 release is going to be kind of moving away from compensating controls. And I think that was there, and I think PCI 4.0 is going to move away from that. Maybe you could talk about that. Maybe tell us what you've seen as what are compensating controls, first of all, and why do you think that there is a bit of a movement away from it?
Yeah, and so first, just a little bit of history here. So the compensating control idea in the PCI requirements is an idea of, I'll just kind of give an example of, well, if I need to monitor a specific system and there's a requirement to do it one way, but you say, well, that won't work for my organization. Because this is a unique system. This is an embedded system. I can't go monitor it in the traditional way. If you have a business requirement or a legitimate technical need, then you can take an alternate approach to it. Assuming the alternate approach still meets at least and preferably above and beyond those original requirements and how you're dealing with that original control. So that's the compensating control. I can't do the original thing, so I'm going to do something else instead that will still meet the spirit of the requirement. What's happening in PCI 4.0 is they're changing the validation approach and using what they've been calling more of an outcome-based approach to this. And in some ways, it's a more liberal or more open definition of compensating controls. So for a compensating control, you had to have a legitimate technological or business reason that you couldn't implement the PCI requirement. In the new 4.0 spec, they're going to give organizations the freedom to say, if I have a new, more modern way of doing things, it doesn't mean that I couldn't have implemented the old PCI requirement. It just means I have an alternative approach to that I think is going to be more effective for my organization. And if you can document and prove to the auditor that your more modern approach is going to be more effective than specifically what the PCI requirement laid out, then that's going to be an acceptable approach.
Yeah, okay.
And that's going to give people a lot more freedom to adopt more modern types of technologies.
I want to comment. I want to comment on that one, because having gone through this, where you come to a QSA and you spend a lot. You spend, let's say, $150,000. The external auditor comes in. They have no idea what technology you're using. They have no understanding of it. And then I kind of found the compensating controls is people don't know their stuff. So you have to put these rules in place so that you don't have a QSA getting fired because you blocked someone from doing something. Perfect example, which is systems that are read-only. Why would I put an antivirus on a read-only system? Google offers Container OS. It's read-only. In our circumstance, the QSA said, no, you must put an antivirus. I said, for what? It's a read-only system. No one can touch anything on it. So in that circumstance, we put it on, but technically a compensating control would have said, it's a read-only technology. There's no need for this, but we're going to put it anyways because you asked. I also feel like out of scope also is the same problem. Look, if you want to keep your systems protected, if they go more liberal, be more educated. The reason they went more liberal, because the PCI Council themselves and the QSAs are way behind technology. That is the reason they've made the changes, is I don't know what you're doing, so how can I stop you without understanding it? I'll get in trouble. Same for out of scope. You can choose to put something out of scope and argue away why it's out of scope, or you can choose to say, I didn't do this because of that. The end result is make sure whatever you're doing is as secure as possible, and realize that they're making these changes because they fundamentally understand technology has advanced beyond policy. And then you need to bend policy to match up. I just do good practices, continuously improve them, always assume you have vulnerabilities. And then, yes, if you need a compensating controller, put something out of scope, have good reasons for it, because the only person you're screwing is yourself.
Yeah, and
Thank
just
you,
to, yeah, maybe just to make one more comment, I totally agree with what Shlomo said. And, you know, one of the challenges I think we'll see with this new approach is that expertise in gathering that buy-in from the auditor community. So if you're trying to be the #1 innovator for a new kind of security control, you know, expect that that's going to take you a lot more time from an audit perspective to demonstrate to an auditor, well, this is something that is going to go above and beyond what the requirement says. So certainly the easy approach may still continue to be, you know, find the things that the auditors are already familiar with, that they have experience with. If you can do that, it's probably going to streamline the audit. If you're a more lean forward security organization and you are getting kind of to that leading edge, you know, that's where, you know, the first audit may be a little bit more involved for you.
And so let's talk about that. I mean, technology has changed drastically. One of the areas that PCI 4.0 is going to focus on is going to be the cloud. So let's go to Shlomo first, and David, we're going to come to you in a second. Let's talk about what does the cloud do, containers, you know, all of the stuff that we're talking about to PCI. What are some of the recommendations you have, Shlomo, around, you know, container security? Where do you see some of the biggest mistakes your clients are making? And then we're going to talk to you about what controls you have at Tripwire around the cloud. Shlomo first.
All right, I have my own approach here, but the way I look at this is if you're using someone else's services, you're just doubling the threat vectors. Don't get me wrong, I'm a supporter of cloud adoption, but you need to also realize that mistakes that you make, they can make. So you have double the threat vectors from the modeling perspective. The services that they provide and the services you put on top of it, again, double the threat vector. So I look at cloud as something where if I'm going to be inside, let's say I take your car and it's not my car. I don't know what you've done with it beforehand. I don't know exactly what all the services you have in offer. Understand the risks you take when you take someone else's car. Make sure that you have robust controls in place and then layer them, because in reality, you are now a serious target. Don't get like when you're running in your own private space and someone fronts your IP addresses, they don't know your organization and who your organization is, so they can't actually target you. In the cloud, your IP space is public and it's well known within every nation state. They will attack every single public IP address of the cloud. I've been there. I've had it working with FBI in the past where they called me and said, you have this asset, it's vulnerable, we have someone we're tracking, you're compromised. Oh, thank you very much. Go and fix it, we don't like this. Okay, but the reality is people need to understand the risks. There are more risks, not only from mistakes and having two stacks, but also that the public knows who you are and where you are, and it's an easy target. So layer your approach. I'm not saying be scared, just layer your approach. You can't take an on-premise, I think I do it, someone told me, methodology in the cloud, you will fall over.
Right. Thank you for that. David, maybe to you around Tripwire and what you guys are thinking around. Obviously, that's the future. The cloud is unstoppable for a lot of people, and we're going to have, credit card numbers. We're going to have PCI audits that are going to encompass the cloud. So what is Tripwire doing to address the cloud security?
Yeah, we've seen our customers be moving to the cloud over the last several years pretty aggressively. And it falls into a couple of different areas in terms of what you should do. First, many organizations are going to have a hybrid combination of physical servers, virtualization infrastructure, private cloud, and public cloud infrastructure. And one of the challenges is trying to find a completely disparate tool set and security stack to use for your cloud services separately from your private infrastructure. So, looking for tools that can cross between those infrastructures and give you holistic visibility is something that Tripwire is focused on, so that we can extend controls into the cloud if you're moving in that direction, but still provide that security stack for you, regardless of where you're deploying, but also how you want to deploy the Tripwire technology as well. Give you an example. Kind of back to that file integrity question that you asked earlier, traditionally we would put an agent on a file system, and that's how we would monitor. And that evolved to be also use agentless approaches and a variety of systems as well. Now you think about a cloud native application being developed, and maybe it's using some containerization, some serverless technology, but more than anything, cloud applications today are really a stitching together of different microservices. So if you have configuration, configuration could be living now at a cloud account level. It could be living within one of the cloud services. So for example, with Tripwire, we extended the integrity monitoring to include storage services within public cloud services like Amazon's S3 service, the Azure Storage Blob service. So rather than point to a path and directory on a file system, you can point to a public cloud account you have, into objects within that account that you want to monitor for configuration as well, and then bring those results into the same overall holistic dashboard so that you can cross between those areas. And certainly, that's crossing between infrastructure, platform services, and then you have kind of a whole different problem space when you start thinking about SaaS services as well.
Shlomo, do you want to add anything to kind of the multi-cloud discussion? Do you think that people are going to trust the public cloud, or are going to focus on maybe some of the private clouds that are out there for their PCI infrastructure?
Oh, you may be muted.
You mute yourself.
Sorry. I think people adopt cloud for a multitude of reasons. Some of it could be acquisition. Some of it is you hired a CTO that likes one in particular. So I'd say you're going to always have different snowflakes of how people adopt. The portion that's very important is the burden that puts on a team. which I think, which was basically David's comment, is if I manage both together, one, it's good for visibility, but really it's your ops, your security, your SRE teams that aren't burdened by having independent stacks that they have to manage and then they can't keep up with it. I would take the approach of, I'm not a dashboard person, but that's my own style. Not everybody is the same way. I kind of feel that if you do extended detection and response and use Tripwire to give you insights and then automatically respond regardless of which cloud you're running in, meaning you get automatically engaged, the most important thing, and everybody, when they say threats, the most important piece is time. So when you have an incident, they can't wait. The impact of the incident actually changes based on how much time has passed from when it occurred. So I kind of follow the model, use everything Tripwire has, use all the clouds you got, but if you find anything, get extended detection response, link it to Tripwire's insights, get the right person engaged or the right playbook to play out to stop it in its tracks. Otherwise, you're going to lose more than you expect. Because look, I don't know who else has lived through this. When there's 0 day, if you let 0 day continue, it trashes your system. I watched WannaCry trash a lot of systems in the past, not because of how bad it was, but because how fast it spread. So if you didn't react, you just like, I'll get to that later. It would learn all the subnets, it would spread to other machines, and then you're like, oh, I have 38,000 machines to fix. That's bad. So it's more of take everything that Tripwire sees, they risk rate it for you. Take that risk rating and bring your actions, your security policy as a digital process to automatically respond. Hybrid cloud, multi-cloud, that's the only way to manage that many data centers.
Thank you, Shlomo. Shlomo, one of the areas that PCI is kind of talking about on 4.0 is changes to encryption. And I know this is a bit of a area that you're a bit of an expert around encryption. Maybe you can talk about where do you see the use of encryption when it comes to security? Do you see it as far as, I know that there's multiple levels of encryption solutions out there, block encryption, endpoint encryption, disk encryption. Where do you see the use of encryption come in on securing infrastructure?
Principally, I follow the model of no one should have access to the systems at all outside of break glass. So I do think encryption is needed in the sense that, again, bad things can happen. I think the reason they made the changes, just from watching the industry, is people do practices that superficially look like encryption, but do nothing to protect anything, like base 64 encoding. I can take that string, put it online, decode it, and I have the entire string. So these sorts of encryption methodologies that people are using where they tell the auditor, oh yeah, it's encrypted. He's like, okay, show me. He's, oh, it does look encrypted. Oh, I forgot to tell you, I could copy paste that into a browser and decrypt it. I think they're putting out these things specifically for people putting in secrets that aren't protected, databases that can be accessed that are supposed to be isolated. And they're just putting this in place so that for those that are telling white truths, white lies, that they're not caught off guard. Because the reality is lots of encryption methods are poor. Lots of secret management methods are poor. Putting things in your delivery where someone could literally just decrypt the root password. Those are the sort of things they're trying to put. Again, well, funny thing, we're putting compensating controls in. Encryption doesn't solve everything, but I think it does help close gaps when you are more vulnerable than you say you are. So I am supporting encryption. Generally, I would say as a service that someone gives it to you rather than you managing it yourself and then proving that it's a good encryption.
That's great, Shlomo. Thank you for that. David, going back to you, one of the areas that PCI 4.0 is going to focus on is risk assessment. This seems to be encompassing in all of the sections, understanding risk assessment, which is a bit of a great approach, I think, to security, because that's where it has to start. Maybe you can talk about what Tripwire does around risk assessment, where you guys are focused on, and how your risk assessment tools kind of map across your architecture.
Yep, absolutely. So, when you think about, well, what is a risk assessment in kind of the context of PCI, and PCI will point you to other, other standard approaches from places like NIST that you can look to as well. That risk is really focused primarily around, where are your critical assets? What are the threats to those assets? And those threats tend to come into kind of two key ways that you may have a threat. There could be a vulnerability threat. So known vulnerabilities, and we all know there's over 100,000 of those out there. So obviously that cannot be a manual process. You need to use technology to assess yourself for that. And then system hardening is kind of the other place that plays into the risk for a particular asset, which is what are the security settings for that particular system? Security configuration management is another term people often use for that. So Tripwire both has compliance against policies built into our system, so you can monitor against best practices or your internal security policies for those security settings. And then we have a vulnerability management platform, IP360, which we make available as either physical or virtual appliances, or it's available as a managed service where we marry together the technology along with the expertise on how to run and manage a vulnerability management program for your organization. The third step of risk assessment is, okay, once you know where the risks are, what are you actually going to go do about it? So you need to make sure you have a risk strategy. You have a plan for how are you going to mitigate and remediate issues when you find them. And the reality is, for any decent size organization, there will always be vulnerabilities that exist in the environment. You're never going to get it down to zero vulnerabilities. And you can for a particular system or application, but probably not broadly across the entire scope. And so you need to have that process of how do we prioritize? How do we know how quickly I need to act? What are your internal SLAs? And then you create that process, and then it's just a tactical day in, day out process of finding the vulnerabilities, prioritizing, taking remediation action. And if you do that effectively, then you're able to take kind of a big risk assessment and turn it into a continuous process. And that's one of the things, that's one of the themes of the new 4.0 spec, which is try to move to a more continuous process for security.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that seems, as I read the requirements, automation, risk assessment, all of these things are absolutely part of the 4.0. So, with that, I'm going to maybe go back to, Shlomo, final words before the question and answers around PCI. What are some of the, things that if I was going to approach you today, say, help me out with PCI, what would be some of the top of mind things that you would recommend to me? You're muted again.
Thanks. I think most organizations, it's because when I drink water, I don't want to interrupt anybody. But I find of all the organizations we work in where they're trying to practice better security, they're still having challenges where security is an afterthought. What happens there is, as application security in many countries is not very robust, yet the new version is focusing more on secure coding practices. I know we talk a lot about secure coding practices, how they can be done, but most people haven't implemented them. So I think the documentation, thought leadership, and methods exist, but the use cases in organizations that need this is it's not implemented. And what I would say to organizations that currently outsource PCI compliance, they'll have significant challenges because the development processes, which is core to their business, the software they provide that is being protected by someone else, isn't sufficient anymore. So be very prepared for June. When June arrives, you will not be able to apply for a new PCI DSS application, meaning an existing one could technically renew, but a new one won't. And if you're doing a new one, you better have your software engineering practices well documented, regardless of if you delegate. The software engineering practices, if it's someone else, make sure they're okay. If it's your own because you were delegating everything else, except for the core of the application, now it's in scope. I think most QSAs in the past were like, I wish we could check if these apps are secure and how they're developed and the supply chain is secure. Now you're going to have to do things like that. And I'd say start now, because building out CI/CD, building out good, secure software engineering practices probably take half a year to a year. You already don't have that anymore. So I would recommend focusing on that. And then everything else, like, obviously we've talked about DevSecOps and leverage capabilities of tools out there to reduce the burden to span multiple data centers. But again, don't forget, if you delegate out right now, you're getting new scope that no one can own for you.
Thank you for that, Shlomo. Why don't we open up, for sake of time, some questions and take on some questions from the attendees. Malika, did you have some questions that you can share with us? Okay.
She's on mute.
Yeah, Shlomo, you were right. So we got one question. How do you manage rapid change in tech environment with automation?
Yeah, maybe I'll take a first stab at that. So, I think one of the important things to realize is you will have, thousands of changes happening across a broad spectrum of systems. And so it's really important, one, that you can log and record every change that's happening to critical parts of your applications and business processes. Two, that you don't need a manual process to review every change. So make a particular focus on how are we going to filter down from the top of the funnel of every change that we see, which you're going to log and record for a forensic perspective. So if you need to go back, that you have that information, you can see what happened to a particular system, but then you can funnel down. And the steps of the funnel could be, just really simply, number one, is it a change that violated our security policies? And that could be mapping back directly to compliance frameworks and specs that you're trying to adhere to, like PCI. Number two, after you get through, is it approved or is it unapproved for your organization? So that can be a second funnel of it's an approved change. And then the third one would be, is it creating a security risk? Has it changed the security posture of the application, the system, the business process? So if you go through those three steps of the funnel and you can get that efficient for your organization, then you're going to get down to a very small set of changes from the top of the funnel to the bottom. And those bottom funnel, maybe those are ones that you want to deliver to the SOC or the SIM for incident response, as Shlomo talked about. Maybe you're going to deliver those to the application owners to review and say, why were these things happening? We didn't expect to see those. So maybe there was a process violation, or maybe someone just made an accident or made an error in how the change was made. And you're going to produce the third place to the audit prep. So it's also going to be the evidence for the auditor that you followed the process and that you were capturing these kind of things.
I will take it from, let's say you're an advanced organization and you've built pipelines. I think the most important thing of taking, rapid change within technology is that you need to create, using the bailiwick of each division, dev, ops, and security, or however you name them today. As we know, there's title changes. The context is to create conformance requirements. What I mean by that is if I have 14 ways to adopt technology and measure security and threat, I'm going to make sure that everybody knows those 14 ways, and I'm going to check your pipelines that are doing this to prevent technical debt. If technology adapts, and now I'm further from compliance because technology has changed, you would then change that conformance so that think of it as the gold standard that measures all your pipelines, to say you're missing now another component. That's a good thing. My comment to everybody is rapid technology change affects you. It prevents you from getting to a fixed mindset. It keeps you on a growth mindset because you'll never hit 100. So think of it as if I have a method to measure everything to say, am I compliant or not? As you're approaching 100, you then change the standards and say, oh no, there's another technology. We need to incorporate this. There's a new method you need to consider. Here's a new thing you need to measure. Here's an output I want to see. It's going to tell you now you're 95. So it's perfect. Rapid technology prevents someone from getting to a fixed mindset, continuously creates a growth mindset as long as you're giving direct feedback to where it's being measured when you're adding that new technology requirement, so that they know right at the start, oh, now I'm 95, I was 98 yesterday. It's very important. Otherwise, what happens is you build technical debt within your security practice. Or how people adopt your security practice. They need to get feedback to say that the security practice has adapted, new technologies need to be adopted, and you don't have them, go and get it. without a meeting?
So so there is I mean, before we close down, just I want to maybe give you guys a last word. I want to thank you all for the time. We're what I got from the conversation is that all the QSAs need to become DevOps engineers. They have to understand at least DevOps, because I think everyone's going through automation. Everyone's going to go toward a risk management process that is going to manage PCI and automate it and have the documentation within that pipeline. So any final words around PCI?
Ali, one more question.
Oh, sure. Won't
Have
you
you-
read it for us, Malika?
Of course. Have you created an assessment that we can use to see if we are prepared for PCI version 4?
I mean, for sure. I'll let David also. Like we do assessments very frequently around software engineering practices, and we usually use the SAC to help guide principally if they're following things. But the way that the 4 is changing, I think it's very important you assess yourself now, especially from your software engineering practices, because they're not easy. There is no easy fix to secure coding. Go for it, David.
Yeah, and I would say, this isn't something that Tripwire does as much directly as we partner with organizations like Benchmark to work with customers directly, because they have a kind of a broader view of the overall requirements beyond what the Tripwire provides. So I would encourage you to follow up with Shlomo about this.
I was going to say, you could just say we're awesome. I'm good with that.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, we do PCI audits. The obviously the draft of version 4.0 is not finalized, so no one's really has an assessment against it. But there are trickles of information that are out in the market. We have a extensive deck around that information. Anyone on the call that wants to understand what to prepare for, we're more than happy to jump in and go over the changes line by line and see where you stand. And go from there. But I thought this hour was very productive around some of the strategic changes that someone has to make. This is 4.0, right? It's a major change to the PCI audit. So we're I want to thank both Shlomo and David for your time. And I always learn new stuff when I speak to both of you. So thank you for your time. If there's no more questions, I want to thank everyone. Go ahead, Monica.
Just one more came in. Sorry, Shlomo and
Sure.
David. How do you automate the validation that the change was approved? Which change control tools and which ones?
Sure.
Sure. So first to take that, it's integrating into the existing IT environment of a particular organization. And one of the things important to that is to make sure that you're selecting tools and partners that have open ecosystems, extensive integrations out of the box that have worked in a wide variety of different environments. So for Tripwire, we have integration to different change reconciliation systems. Today, the most popular of those tend to be things like ServiceNow, Cherwell, historically, a lot of Remedy. And for more modern DevOpsy environments, it could be integration into tools in the CI/CD pipeline as well. So it's integrating into those tools, pulling out the information about what changes are approved based on that, and doing some automated matching based on those rules. And it's going to depend on the maturity of that process. So exactly how much detailed you can get into that change reconciliation process.
So I'll take it from a CI/CD perspective, which is there are 3 things that you need to do using those calls when you want to integrate change and approval into the CI/CD process. You need update, create, and close. Create is all. Most people think that's there, but it's not usually when you use the native plugins, because people think tickets are created before pipelines run, but actually pipelines are triggered and then tickets need to be created. So I follow the model of ticket is created with the right metrics. It's updated as the process promotes that you're well informed of what was tested prior and what vulnerabilities were found. When the ticket finishes, you close, but there's 2 pieces that are still missing, which is sync processes. You need to link your CI/CD to, let's say, Jira, ServiceNow, which are the most common. And you want to look for 2 fields. One, the approval field, to validate one, things are approved from a promotion process or vulnerability perspective or release. And then the second is schedule. You sometimes have a particular window when you have compliance. There are a lot of regulations and contracts that you've signed that says you can't do whenever you want. You would then schedule a particular window, let's say in ServiceNow, scheduled for X 2 hours. The pipeline then needs to sync the approval as well as the window so that it can run when it needs to. I kind of find everything that Tripwire does would be part of the output of update the ticket. So if you take the context of CI/CD being the central place of it, and it damn well better be, you would then go to all of the technology providers and say, are you okay? Output. Are you okay? Output. Then you'd have a threshold or spec file that says these are tolerable or not, or you'd have a team that would look at the output to approve, but the pipeline will then go back to sync with two fields. Approval is given, and when is that approval for? I hope that articulated change management within the context of DevSecOps within CI/CD.
That was great. Thank you, Shlomo. Thank you, Dave. Again, audience, if that are on the call or anyone that sees this video, if you need more information, both Benchmark's contact information is easily available at www.benchmarkcorp.com. I'm sure Tripwire as well, tripwire.com. You can there's many white papers there that you can download and go deeper, or reach out to your local account manager. I want to thank you, both of you, for attending today's call. And let's see what happens with 4.0. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more discussions we can have in the future. Thank you all.
Thank you.